Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Nano Challa wash processed Ethiopia from the barn. And there's the bag right there. And the barn, based out of Berlin, Germany, and they were originally a suggestion to us by Christopher. So shout out to and thank you to Christopher for the suggestion. This is now their third time appearing on this channel, having previously reviewed one of their natural processed Costa Rican coffees, as well as more recently one of their wash processed Guatemalan coffees. And while we weren't necessarily the biggest fan of the Costa Rican, it was the Guatemala that really impressed me. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how this coffee compares to those two, given that this one's definitely more my flavor profile. However, it is a washed Ethiopian coffee, and I tend to be a little bit more critical of washed Ethiopians in general. So we'll see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 27 of this coffee. And recipe we went with for this coffee was the recipe that the barn has on their website, a 15.625 to 1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 94 degrees Celsius. And I like this one better through the V60, which would indicate a more medium fine grind. However, with the barn's coffees, I do tend to find that going slightly more coarse than normal tends to work a little better. It's the case with this coffee for sure, and the barn is a European light for the roast profile. With those things out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and the coffee was skewing a little bit more on the floral side than initially expected. So I think they have apricot and I want to say lavender as the flavor notes that they have listed on here. And it was definitely skewing on the more purple floral side of things, as there was a fair bit of the stone fruit, but it was definitely the secondary characteristic. And what was kind of interesting was it did have this ever so slight pastry-like sweetness that I oftentimes pick up from standard washed Panamanian coffees. So that's a huge positive for me already, given Panamanian coffees tend to be my favorite coffees in the entire world. So it was a decent first impression. I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of how it was skewing a little bit more in the floral direction than the fruity direction that early on. It was also a little bit more toned down than I think I was expecting. Day 16, another slightly more floral side cup of coffee today, as this one had a fair bit of the stone fruit aroma. And I think that's the thing that really got to me on these early days, was the coffee smells really stone fruit like you can pick up so much of that apricot flavor note that they have listed on here in the grounds as well as the beans themselves. It's once I was making the cup that I wasn't able to get that same sort of vibrancy that I was able to get from the aroma of the coffee itself. Again, a little frustrating, as there was a fair bit of chocolate as the cup of coffee had cooled down, which wasn't necessarily my favorite. Slightly more floral with the secondary stone fruit characteristic yet again. Mind you, I didn't realize that the barn likes to brew their coffees at these much cooler temperatures, so of course going with my standard recipe, which is a little higher than they like. So from these early impressions, not necessarily the best, but we would continue with day 18 as we ran it through the Chemex correction through the V60 and was still struggling to find the best from this coffee, as it was feeling more on the neutral side on this day, as it was somewhat chocolatey as it cools down and was finding even less of the stone fruit. And given just how big of a fan I was of the Guatemalan coffee, having these coffees be a little similar, with this one being the slightly less clean of the two, wasn't necessarily the best. So it was interesting just how much more I was enjoying the Guatemalan on these earlier days. Day 20. Adjusted to the barn's recipe, and this is what happened with the last coffee as well. For whatever reason, when you increase the concentration of this coffee and lower the temperatures, there is just significant improvement, as this was the best day of the coffee to this point. The stone fruits became significantly more pronounced, and that's the big tip I can give for this coffee. A little bit more coarse and more concentrated, lower the temperatures, and as a result, you'll find that this coffee just drastically improves. Much more vibrancy in general, with a nice complementary florality, as at this point they're in pretty much equal measure. Pretty positive. Day 22 ran it through the Chemex with the barn's recipe this time, and was also seeing significant improvement from the earlier Chemex days, as it's cleaner and much more of the stone fruit side of things than compared to the florality. So I think I've mentioned before, oftentimes I tend to like the florality more when it's a little bit more with a jammy sort of stone fruit as opposed to the fresh fruit sort of stone fruit. So while I really do enjoy both of those flavors, I think I was enjoying the florality just a little bit more because it was such a vibrant and interesting floral in this cup of coffee. That's why I preferred the V60 for this one. However, it does come out a little bit more clean and a little bit more stone fruit to the Chemex, so that might be a tip for somebody that really does enjoy those aspects a little bit more, which, funny enough, tends to be me, but in this case, I just like the florality a little bit more. Day 24, back through the V60, and the cup just seems to be improving a lot. So a lot of this can be chalked up to both the adjustments that we had made to the coffee, but in addition to that, maybe just a little bit more rest. I was seeing such improvement from the cup of coffee that's probably a mixture of all of those things. It has heavily accentuated both of the florality as well as the fruitiness in this cup of coffee, as they are both really rich, robust, and pronounced, and I think that can be attributed to a higher concentration in this coffee. In this instance, the cup initially starts out very stone fruit forward before settling kind of quickly into a more vibrant purple florality. And the vibrancy of that purple florality is so pronounced, you'll see it in the tasting wheel that oftentimes you could even kind of describe this maybe as a purple candy, because that's the way I charted the tasting wheel, is it felt almost like a grape candy. That's just how intense it was. Slightly sweet pastry-like finish, which I mentioned on the first day, reminded me a lot of some washed Panamanian coffee, so that's a nice positive. And the liveliness of the florals just very much pronounced towards the end of this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And a lot of level 4, so let's run through those. The cleanliness, level 4. Yeah, it's a really clean cup of coffee. I definitely find more cleanliness as the cup does cool down. The cup of coffee drastically improves as it does cool down as well, so that's one thing I want you to keep in mind. The finish, it does have a very lasting finish. It's a very floral finish, and it's a very pretty floral finish, so I gotta give them a lot of credit for that. The sweetness at a level 4, it's actually on the higher side of that level 4. It's a really, really good sweetness, and it's this very Panamanian-like finish, which is such a positive. Acidity, level 4. I would probably tone that down as it does cool down, as I would probably push that down to a level 3, but the higher temperatures can be a little acidic, not too surprising. It's a very light coffee. Florality, level 4. Yeah, I think a lot of factors go into that. I kind of mentioned that it's a very lively purple sort of florality, but in addition to that, it does remind me of those Panamanian coffees, which are so floral, so maybe kind of like that vanilla sugar cookie sweetness to it, which I like to lump into the florality as well. And then the stone fruit at level 4. Stone fruit, quite pronounced. Certain days, Chemex, you could push that very higher side of level 4, but for the most part, level 4, pretty accurate from what I was getting when suggested to the Barnes recipes. Berry fruit, I mentioned that I was able to get this like kind of grape candy, which could have just been the really lively purple florality, but I could justify grape, and that's why I pushed the berry fruit all the way up to a level 4. Body, I would say it's on the slightly higher side of level 2, probably attributed to the higher concentration. And then you've got a little bit of some extras, like a slight bit of bitterness, which comes from this very slight citrus that I was getting from it, as well as a slight bit of spice and a slight bit of saltiness. However, as the cup does cool down, it structures very nicely, and it becomes a very sort of even and clean cup of coffee in general. So lots of positives in this tasting wheel, lots of positives about this coffee in general. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I think it was great to have both a wash processed Guatemalan and a wash processed Ethiopian, because I saw so many wonderful things from both of these coffees. And it does go to show that if you do try something and review something that maybe not necessarily your flavor profile, your preference, in the case of that natural processed Costa Rican, it can kind of give you the wrong impression of a coffee roaster that otherwise might actually be really, really good. Both of these are really, really good cups of coffee. I can say that that was the best wash processed Guatemalan I've had in quite a while, especially for a standard one. And this Ethiopia was really, really good. It was really, really well done, just like that Guatemalan. So at this moment, it's safe to see why the Barn is such a well-respected and loved coffee roaster in general, because they're doing exceptional work. Both these coffees are exceptionally well done from my perspective. So massive kudos to the Barn for that Guatemala and this Ethiopia as well. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, you can't actually lose. If you really like the high sweetness, the high cleanliness, as well as the florality and fruitiness, which are all attributes I absolutely love, then this is a good fit for you, because you can find a way to make this coffee maybe a little bit more on the floral side and maybe a little bit more on the fruity side. And that's a really nice thing for me, because it essentially made me decide which cup of coffee I wanted to brew on that day, and that's a huge selling point to me as well. Given the really nice structure that comes from this cup of coffee, there are so many positives. Of course, keep in mind the lighter profile, but for the most part, I think this is kind of the way I'll leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from the Barn, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Nano Challa wash processed Ethiopia from the Barn. Thank you for watching.